So, what exactly is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, and what have been its major conclusions about the relationships between environmental climate change, human security, and conflict? In this section, I want to delve into more detail what it is, what it's found, and what are the main critiques of its current report on this topic. So, let's see. So the IPCC was created in 1988, so right over 3 decades ago, as an organization, part of the United Nations and the World Meteorological Association, and it was tasked with providing the world with a clear scientific view on the current state of knowledge on climate change and its potential environmental and socioeconomic impacts. So its purpose is to summarize the current state of our understanding about climate change and that implications that would flow on from that for public policy. Currently, it has 195 members, all states that are a member of either the World Meteorological Organization or the United Nations are eligible to join. Every couple of years, it releases a report. The AR5, the one that we read for this week, was the last major report that has been released, and that includes a section on human security and conflict. The next report, AR6, is currently being written now, and estimates are, I think it's aimed to be released in 2022. So what we're reading now is a few years old, but represents the current state of the literature as of that time period. Its research approach is through summarizing the literature and evaluating its own reports, reports from the IPCC working groups, and through peer-reviewed publication outlets. It does this through a non-blind review process and without a blind scholar selection process, the implications of which we'll discuss in a little bit. I think as someone who has worked through the blind peer review process now for longer than I'd care to admit, and I've gotten more rejections than I'd care to admit. It is definitely not a perfect process to have double blind peer review, and now I know that some journals actually do triple blind peer review. So single blind peer review you often get with book length manuscripts when you submit a book to a publisher. Usually that gets sent out for external review if the editors think it has a chance of being published, and the reviewer knows who the author of the book is, because for a book it's often not practical to have double blind peer review because of the how small certain subfields are and the amount of work that goes in through other works, including journal articles, in creating a book. And so for a book, you often get single blind peer review in which you as the author don't know who reviewed your book, but the reviewer knows whose book it is that they're reading. Double blind peer review is when the author doesn't know who reviews their work and the reviewer doesn't know whose work they're reading and reviewing. The benefits of that kind of approach are that if you know someone in the field, or have personal animus, or you have someone who's submitting a work that's a junior scholar, you want to make sure it's the work that goes in front and that you're reviewing the work, not necessarily the scholar that produced it. Oftentimes there is a worry that senior level scholars will get things accepted just because of their name, and it might not represent the kind of quality of work they might have created in the past. Triple blind peer review is review in which the editor, so the author doesn't know who's reviewing their work, the reviewer doesn't know whose work they're reviewing, and the editor themselves don't know who reviewed the work, and that who wrote the work, which should also allow for the potential of reduction of bias of editors in deciding whether to desk reject, not send something out for review, or to send it to reviewers who they might think are more receptive to an approach or not, that it's just focused on the work. And so, linking it back to the IPCC's report, it's significant that there's no blind review process in how the scholars are selected to review the literature. And often there's a pressure, as we're going to see in the critique of the IPCC's approach, in making sure you have scholars from a wide assortment of different countries that might not have a similar familiarity with the work, or what work has been influential or groundbreaking in a particular area. So this research methodology described in the chapter that we read for this week, I have it here someplace. Yes, the chapter on human security. Hopefully this should look familiar for those students in my class. This is basically a literature review, right? So this quote from the chapter kind of indicates to what extent both scholars are doing this as students, as researchers for their own work, as well as for work that has such important policymaking importance, like the IPCC's reports. The assessment is based on structured reviews of scientific literature. It was carried out using searches of scientific databases of relevant studies from 2000 to 2013. So they use online databases like Scopus or Web of Science, similar to what students in my class do for our literature reviews. You set a discrete time frame for when the articles have been published, with the idea that more recent studies included a foundation of knowledge that occurred beforehand, but it's recent cutting edge knowledge that's been published in recent years. And the searches were targeted at core dimensions of the kind of effects of climate change that they're looking at in this chapter: culture, indigenous peoples, traditional knowledge, migration, conflict, transboundary resources. And then they also did open searches to look at other non-journal literature, including working papers, which I thought was interesting. And the dominant findings that they summarize in this literature and is their interpretation of it. So it's basically a literature review, a systematic literature review, trying to be as transparent as possible, looking at what the major findings are. So this research process is similar no matter what stage you're actually conducting it at. A couple of the main findings from this report, which is now 6 years old, but in a lot of ways received global attention both in the halls of power as well as in the national media around the world, because of these graphs from this report. Some of them which are outside the scope of the assigned reading for this week, but I thought would be useful as a kind of recap for the size and scope of the changes that they're looking at, their effects on human security and conflict. The four graphs here show the increase in average land and ocean surface temperatures. Going back to 1850, you see that quite dramatic increase since 1950 on the upper left, and then you average by decades. Different studies use different time frames. We've seen over and over in this class that the assumptions that you make about who you're looking at, when you're looking at them, and how you decide on what level of analysis and time frame to look at can often affect the kind of findings that you're going to get. And so here you can look at the increased noise in the annual measures in the upper left, and the decade measures are smoothing that out somewhat. So you see that increase in 1970s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. You also see on the right side the decline in sea ice from 1980 and in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, which will be relevant for later on today, and the low global sea level rise that we've seen has been pretty much non-monotonic. It's just gone up since around 1900. So you see this quite dramatic change in temperatures, decrease in sea ice, and the rise in sea level there. And then you also see, as a driver of this, the greenhouse gas emissions that have occurred over the decades. And you see the one that's been attributed to different types of resource extraction, fossil fuels, cement, and natural gas flaring in gray down on the bottom, and the decrease in available land use for forestry on the bottom. And so you see, the trends that we've seen over the course of the semester, but I think viscerally it's dramatic to see how quickly this has changed over time. You can extend it back a millennium and you wouldn't see, there would be even more of a hockey stick increase. The chapter that we're looking at for today is focusing on what effects that might have on human security, focused on what effects the literature has already suggested has been found to date, to 2013 when they wrote this report. And I think the main conclusions are that the human security is being threatened by climate change by undermining livelihoods, compromising culture and identity, increasing migration, and changes states' capacity to be able to respond to their citizens' needs, which have been changing over time given the changing environment in which they live. And hopefully some of this will be recapping what we've already seen over the course of the semester, and a lot of the literature that they actually include in this review is the kind of literature we've included in our readings for this semester as well. I think less has been included on the culture and identity aspects. I've focused more on political institutions, economic institutions, geographic institutions, but I think culture and identity is definitely an important aspect that they talk about, and there's a lot of interesting research being done on that I'm less familiar with. They summarize their findings in a couple of incredibly detailed tables that I'm not going to go through, but you see as a way of summarizing the effects of research, a large amount of research in a relatively concise area. A tip for your research essays that you can summarize the main kind of arguments for the areas that you're looking at, the dimensions of impact, the examples of impact, and further illustrative examples for livelihoods, for culture, and for migration. So a lot of the similar effects and aspects of human security we've already kind of touched on. Oh, a few more for migration. I couldn't get it all in one slide. And they summarize this in a figure. You know me by now that I am visually minded as a way to kind of summarize multi-step processes and a lot of factors all at one time. I think this graph does it better than another one that we're going to look at in a second. But the basic takeaway is they're looking at two main factors. One is the vulnerability to environmental change. We've seen that vulnerability is the exposure to risks due to climate change that certain populations have, and then people's well-being also varying from low to high. And then you add on to this the people's ability to move. And so you see people's vulnerability to climate change is higher where people's existing well-being, however you want to define that, as being relatively low before this change happened, and then people are unable to move. They can't adapt through migration. They have to try to adapt in place, and that's quite difficult over time. And your ability to move decreases your vulnerability. Speaking as someone who's an American living in Australia, I viscerally appreciate the lower vulnerability that I have to a certain pandemic that's going on than if I were in the United States at this time period. Other threats of climate change, according to the IPCC, the cultural values that I mentioned briefly before, indigenous or local forms of knowledge that might be lost, but also could be helpful in learning how to adapt. In the Arctic section, a bit later on, you'll see an example of this with the traditional populations of Nunavut in Canada, how they've witnessed the changes in their environment over the last couple of decades and have had to work to try to adapt to that. So indigenous knowledge can also be crucial in people's well-being and ability to adapt without necessarily having to move. Migration and mobility are definitely clear adaptation strategies. We've already talked about that. And of course, there's also demonstrated gender differences in the effects of migration, increased vulnerability and responsibility. in traditional migration patterns for economic migration, it's usually young males or young females who are more likely to move. By and large, young males in a lot of developing countries going either through south-south migration or to the Middle East or to North America and the U.S. But also there's gender differences in other aspects of human security vulnerability, from having to walk further to get water, or for having their loved ones having to go abroad to seek work and income, as we saw with the Central Asian example a couple of weeks ago. They also talk about violent conflict and the effects on climate change. A lot of the things, hopefully, we're all familiar with after 12 weeks of this class. We're going to talk about a little more about that in a second. The IPCC also summarizes different ways that people have adapted to climate change induced scarcity or impacts, the likes of which we've already covered in this class. You can either diversify your source of income in agricultural and fishing systems. You can either change the type of crop you're growing or the type of fish that you catch, or you have to move to be able to catch fish as they move to different areas due to temperature change, which we're going to see in the Arctic section. There's been reports I read recently about U.S. crop production that in certain areas, where corn is now able to be grown has shifted north, or the corn planting times have moved up about a month from where they were a couple of decades ago. Migration is clearly also a way to mitigate, to manage risk. We saw examples of that in Louisiana, in Eastern Africa, a bunch of ways at trying to manage this risk of a changing climate. Insurance systems for vulnerable groups is something that we also haven't touched on that much. In the foreign aid literature, there's been a lot of discussion about what ways to provide insurance would be helpful for people who are often unbanked or don't have record keeping in order to try to justify their access to certain resources or territory. And that's why I think the research on universal basic income is getting attention across the political spectrum. We'll see if experimentation of that continues on in subsequent years. Other adaptation strategies also include adapting consumption patterns. What we buy as humans is culturally determined, as well as determined by individual preferences. I've definitely noticed in shifting cultures over the years, consumption patterns have similar basic categories, but the preferences categories within them is definitely different and culturally embedded. You don't realize what you miss food-wise until you live someplace else, even some places culturally similar as Australia and the U.S. Another example of a graph summary from this report that I found a bit more confusing, but I know that some of you like the more complex graphs that include more detail, as we saw from the previous week's workshop, that you have also two main things varying: the scale of insecurity and the climate stress. And you see how these factors that we've looked at over the course of the semester often overlap, that we've tried to tease apart the separate individual effects or causal arrows, but you see how similar things vary with increasing insecurity at the local, national, or international levels, and increasing climate change. That as climate stress increases, that increases both the likelihood of conflict as well as cultural change, as people are forced to move to urban areas, as we've seen so far in this class, in order to earn a living, change the industry that they work on, lose the cultural connection to the land or the traditional languages because they moved away from their elders. That can cause also risks to livelihoods as well, and that migration and mobility isn't quite as affected with climate change, with climate stress. They'll be interested to see what effect this exogenous shock of COVID-19 has had on international migration patterns. I know that migration to Australia and the US and other countries that I'm familiar with has declined quite dramatically over the last 8 months, and there's been some research looking at how levels of poverty and individual stress, income and social and cultural has also increased over the last 8 months, that you don't have this kind of adaptation strategy available to you, at least internationally, but in some cases domestically as well. Conflict is the largest kind of relationship, but is one that we've seen is often the most indirect and hard to make a kind of causal connection to it. They go into a lot more detail about all these different risks. Each one of these reports is incredibly detailed and is a result of hundreds and hundreds of people reading thousands of papers, discussions, working groups to decide what can be considered settled knowledge or what would be considered of greatest risk. And these are also a systematic synthesis that involves a lot of other considerations and more conscious discussion that often gets measured with these kind of literature reviews. The main connections to climate change and conflict are those kind of direct and indirect ones we've already seen over the course of 12 weeks. Most of the evidence in the report that they talk about, as well as that we've read over the course of the semester, suggests that the links are most likely to be indirect and speculative for what is likely to happen in the future, given the changes that have been estimated to occur over the next decades of the 21st century, and there hasn't been a solid empirical foundation for these kind of risks for conflict. Looking at one specific example from the report, they talk about the Darfur conflict in Western Sudan. All studies of this conflict agree that it is not possible to isolate any of these specific causes as being the most influential, which is difficult and is emblematic of a lot of the different works that we've looked at over the course of this semester, that you have many completing explanations and it's hard to tell which one is the most important. One of the main contributing factors in qualitative research for deciding what's influential is the individual judgment of the author who's writing the report, or of the people that they interview, or the secondary sources that they use. It's often a judgment call. Same with quantitative research, right? The results might look a bit different, but in quantitative research, you also make decisions about what you include, how you specify your models that can lead you to make conclusions about what is most substantively important. So in a lot of ways, it's subjective and tentative and snapshots in time, that it's only through kind of systematic reviews and over time a literature matures to the extent that there can be overall conclusions. But any particular work is a snapshot in time and is necessarily incomplete and based on a whole bunch of assumptions. And yeah, they also talk about the endogenous relationship between climate change and adaptability and conflict. Many of the capabilities required to adapt to climate change are threatened by ongoing or recent armed conflict. So you have the climate stresses leading to the scarcities that we've seen so far this semester that can lead to conflict. Then conflict also can exacerbate those scarcities, or the difficulty of individuals or governments to be able to respond to citizens' needs. So you see the causal arrow going both ways even there. Moving on to a critique that I thought would be interesting to look at of this particular report, the Niels Peter Gleditsch and Gleditsch Nordis' article, Conflicting Messages, the IPCC on Conflict and Human Security. I think it is something I've tried to incorporate over the course of this semester, not just including one article as the be-all and end-all of conclusions, but to try to see research as a discussion between people who spend a lot of time thinking and reaching conclusions through research about different outcomes. That Niels Peter Gleditsch, we've seen over the course of the semester, has been quite influential for trying to understand the relationship between climate and conflict. Their main critiques, which we're going to talk more about in the workshop, is that IPCC defines human security so generally that it makes it harder to track these trends empirically, which is one of the elements that we talked about in the earlier weeks when we tried to quantify human security as a multifaceted conflict and tried to break it up into specific observable implications of what we think of as human security. But the IPCC, in trying to throw as wide a net as possible around the literature about what you might consider human security, makes it harder to look at trends overall in an empirical manner. And they contrast the definition of human security that we've already touched on with one focused on the likelihood of people of being victims of various forms of violence. A definition that is quite narrow and empirically clear, but it's hard to think about what you capture when you think of human security. So, like with conflict, when we started this semester, I tried to empirically define what we consider civil conflict, a contest between two groups that were initially subject to the same sovereign authority at the beginning of the conflict. One of those actors is the government. One is a group fighting the government for a particular reason, and they have to have fatal encounters that lead to a certain death threshold, either 25 people or 200 or 1,000, depending on the different study. And that's conceptually clear, but when people think of human security, you can think of things related to livelihood or related to culture or identity that are aspects of what we would undoubtedly think of as human security, health being another one, but is quite different in its likely effects, that you could have climate change effects having more direct impacts on people's livelihoods, and that is a more direct effect than something, but less easy to measure than something like conflict, which would be maybe one step removed in that causal process. So you trade off between conceptual clarity and concreteness versus generalizability, and matching on to the general idea that we're trying to talk about when we're talking about elements like human security. And their third point is that there's a real danger that any kind of social change is disliked by some group and that becomes a threat to someone else's human security. We are large and complex societies in the 21st century. We break up into different identifiable groups with different identities depending on who you are and who you're interacting to. And any kind of change, as we've seen in the Political Institutions Week, can be a danger to a certain groups that benefit from the current distribution of power, but could also be an opportunity for others to try to shift that distribution. And so you can have pretty much any kind of conflict event that could be a human security threat to a certain population, depending on what you're looking at. And so it is a danger that everything becomes a threat to human security if you define it broadly enough. And that was, I think, one of their main critiques, is that the general nature of the report is one of the necessities and the raison d'etre of the IPCC, but it also can be difficult when you're building on such a large quantity of different kinds of literature that you can be general to the point of tautology. And so I think for me, in trying to think about what the IPCC is, and with the new report that'll come out in a couple of years, there was supposed to be a COP26, the meeting of the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. The one that was supposed to be held next month was postponed. It's supposed to be in Glasgow in November in 2020. It's now postponed to Glasgow in 2021. There was also going to be a Youth for Climate Change event there that was undoubtedly going to get a lot of attention. That these are snapshots in time, and the IPCC, because it's so large and complex, it's been critiqued over the couple of years for individual emails sent by individual scholars that go into the report, that it's an inherently political and economic process because of the implications of the reports that they've generated. But I think overall, the hard science, the kind of science that goes into the graphs about temperature, climate, and ice loss, are more concrete and less grounded in assumptions and generalizability concerns about terms like human security, because I think human security, because it is a more social phenomenon than ocean temperature, is harder to kind of grasp the relationship between the different kinds of changes than just between sea temperature and land temperature, or sea ice melt and the level of the oceans increasing. But I think it shows the development of the IPCC's efforts to try to understand the implications of climate change. It's going beyond, in recent years, just the study of what's actually happening to what the potential effects of these changes going on. And this is an inherently difficult and multifaceted effort, and is more tentative given to the complexity of how we define human security, as well as how conflict, as we've seen over the course of the semester, often is a stage or two removed beyond these simple scarcity challenges that are often faced by climate change. But it is important, groundbreaking work that is likely to have implications in my lifetime, let alone in your lifetime. So I think I'll end this section with my first lecture question. I try to get your take on what are the ways that the IPCC suggests that climate change threatens human security. Do you find the most compelling, interesting, important, however you want to define it, and why? Undermining livelihoods, compromising culture and identity, increasing migration, or challenging state capacity. I think this touched on a couple of the main themes of the class, and I'd be interested to see at this stage which one of those relationships you find the most compelling, and the way that it's put forward by the IPCC. So you can answer on Waddle, and we will continue on in the next section looking at international water resource cooperation as a way to look at a little more optimistic take on the potential for cooperation given these kind of changes.